A spacecraft is bleeding out in the middle of the void. For NASA, this is the nightmare they've spent a decade trying to prevent. In the next few seconds, hundreds of engineers on the ground in Houston spring into action. The flight director, the EECOM, the trajectory officers, the capsule communicators. What happens next will decide the fate of 3 men. If NASA succeeds, the crew of Apollo 13 will make it home, and the agency will prove that human ingenuity can conquer the absolute hostility of space. But if they fail, 3 American heroes will suffocate, freeze, or burn up on re-entry, and it will paralyze the nation's space program. This is the moment that determines everything. When a multi-billion-dollar machine fails 200,000 miles from home. How does a seemingly perfect spacecraft turn into a death trap? And how do the people on the ground solve an impossible puzzle with no room for error? Houston, Texas, April 1970. The American public is completely exhausted. The space race is over. The US beat the Soviets to the moon the previous summer with Apollo 11, and they went back again with Apollo 12. Now it's Apollo 13's turn. Commander Jim Lovell is an aviation legend, making his 4th trip into space. But the truth is, nobody cares. The public sees landing on the moon the same way they see a commercial flight from New York to Chicago. The major television networks are so completely bored by the mission that they refuse to even broadcast the crew's live television feed from the ship. And the crew thinks it's a milk run, too. For the first 55 hours, the flight is incredibly smooth. The spacecraft is performing perfectly. But the Apollo spacecraft is a machine made of over 6 million individual parts, and it only takes one to bring the whole thing down. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand the anatomy of the Apollo spacecraft. It's not one ship, it's 3. At the front is the command module, called Odyssey. This is the cockpit. It's where the crew lives, and it's the only part of the ship equipped with a heat shield to survive the fiery re-entry back to Earth. Attached to the nose is the Lunar module, called Aquarius. It's a fragile, lightweight lander designed strictly to ferry 2 men down to the moon's surface and back. And behind the command module is the service module. This is the engine room. It holds the massive propulsion engine, the fuel cells that generate electricity, and the massive tanks of highly pressurized, supercooled liquid oxygen. Right here is oxygen tank number 2. And inside this tank is a flaw that NASA completely missed. 5 years earlier, in a manufacturing plant, this specific tank was accidentally dropped a mere 2 inches. It seemed harmless. The tank was inspected, cleared, and eventually installed into Apollo 13. A few weeks before launch, during a routine countdown test, engineers needed to empty the liquid oxygen out of the tanks, but tank number 2 wouldn't empty properly. To speed up the process, they decided to turn on the internal heaters to boil the oxygen off. What they didn't know was that a recent design change meant the heaters were drawing 65 volts of electricity, but the protective thermostat switches inside the tank were only rated for 28 volts. The thermostat welded shut. For 8 hours, the heater baked the inside of the tank. The temperature reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The Teflon insulation on the wires completely melted away, leaving bare copper exposed inside a tank of pure, highly flammable oxygen. Nobody noticed. The sensors on the ground maxed out at 80 degrees, so the engineers thought everything was fine. They loaded a bomb onto a Saturn V rocket and blasted it into space. April 13th, 55 hours and 53 minutes into the mission. Down in Houston, the electrical, environmental, and consumables manager, a 29-year-old engineer named Cy Liebergott, notices a slight pressure drop in oxygen tank 2. He asks the capsule communicator to have the crew stir the cryos. Liquid oxygen turns into a thick slush in 0 gravity. Inside the tanks are small fans. Turning them on stirs the slush and fixes the pressure reading. It's a completely standard procedure. Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert flips the switch. Electricity hits the bare wires. They arc. The resulting fire instantly pressurizes the tank, blowing it apart with the force of 3 pounds of dynamite. It tears the side panel off the spacecraft, knocks out the main communications antenna, and violently damages oxygen tank number 1 beside it.
Houston, we've had a problem.
At first, Mission Control refuses to believe it. Liebergott looks at his screens. The ship is losing power, losing oxygen, and drifting off course. He assumes it's a massive instrumentation glitch. But then, Jim Lovell looks out the window. He sees the spacecraft venting a gas into space. It isn't a glitch. The ship is literally bleeding to death. Flight Director Gene Kranz locks the doors to Mission Control. The objective immediately changes. They are no longer going to the moon. They are running a rescue mission. The command module relies entirely on the oxygen and fuel cells in the blown-out service module. It has only 15 minutes of power left. The only way to survive is to shut the entire command module down to save its batteries for re-entry and use the Lunar module as a lifeboat. But the Lunar module is designed to support 2 guys for 45 hours. It now needs to support 3 guys for 90 hours. It doesn't have enough water. It doesn't have enough power. And most dangerously, it doesn't have enough air filters. Every time the crew exhales, they fill the tiny cabin with toxic carbon dioxide. The Lunar module has chemical scrubbers to clean the air, but they quickly max out. If the CO2 levels keep rising, the crew will become confused, pass out, and die. There are plenty of fresh filters sitting in the dead command module, but there is a lethal design flaw. The command module was built by North American Rockwell. The Lunar module was built by Grumman, and they didn't talk to each other. The filters in the command module are square. The holes in the Lunar module are round. In Houston, engineers are locked in a room with a pile of the exact equipment the astronauts have on board: plastic bags, flight manual covers, and duct tape. They have to figure out how to fit a square peg into a round hole. Using a spacesuit hose, a cardboard cover, and tape, Mission Control talks the freezing, exhausted crew through building a makeshift adapter. It looks like a high school science project, but it works. The CO2 levels drop. They can breathe, but the math is still trying to kill them. To make the Lunar module batteries last all the way back to Earth, they have to shut down almost every electrical system on the ship. The temperature inside the cabin plummets to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Without power for the heaters, water condenses on the walls and the control panels. The astronauts are shivering uncontrollably. They are completely dehydrated, as they have to strictly ration their drinking water to cool the ship's remaining electronics. And worse, they are drifting off course. If their angle of re-entry is too shallow, they will bounce off the Earth's atmosphere like a rock skipping across a pond, and be lost in space forever. They need to fire the Lunar module's engine to correct their course. But there's a massive problem. To save power, they turned off the navigation computer. They have no autopilot. To fix their trajectory, they have to fly the ship manually. With the ship's thrusters disabled, Commander Jim Lovell has to look out the window and line up the ship's crosshairs with the Earth's terminator line, the boundary between day and night. For 39 agonizing seconds, Lovell controls the pitch and yaw by hand, using a technique they had never actually practiced, while completely exhausted and freezing. The burn is perfect. They are heading home. April 17th. Earth is finally in the window, but the most dangerous part is still ahead. To survive re-entry, they have to abandon their Lunar module lifeboat and get back into the freezing, wet, dead command module. It's the only part of the ship with a heat shield. As they jettison the blown-out service module, the crew finally sees the damage. An entire side of the ship is gone, and a terrifying realization hits Mission Control. Nobody knows if the explosion cracked the heat shield on the command module. If it did, the crew will burn up in the atmosphere in seconds. As they hit the atmosphere at 24,000 miles per hour, the blazing heat creates a shell of ionized plasma around the ship. This plasma cuts off all radio communication. It's known as the blackout period. It is supposed to last exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes pass. Nothing but static. 3.5 minutes. Houston calls out. Odyssey, Houston standing by. Silence. 4 minutes. The world that had been too bored to watch them launch is now holding its collective breath, waiting for a ghost ship. The controllers in Houston fear the worst. The heat shield failed. And then, through the static, a voice. Swigert answers back. The parachutes open, the heat shield held. Against impossible odds, a catastrophic explosion, a frozen ship, and a makeshift duct tape air filter. All 3 men splashed down safely. NASA called Apollo 13 a successful failure. It wasn't the mission they planned, and they never walked on the moon. But it became the ultimate test of human ingenuity, a testament to the hundreds of people on the ground who refused to let 3 men die in the dark. Sometimes the greatest stories in history aren't about everything going right. They're about what happens when everything goes catastrophically wrong. If you want to see more deep dives into the events that shaped our world, make sure to hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.